Now, the guillotine was thought to be the most dignified method of execution. Originally reserved for the nobility, it became the ultimate symbol of equality in revolutionary France. But could the head remain conscious afterwards? Discovery brings you the horror of the guillotine.
The national razor, the widow, the guillotine, the beheading machine that turned a revolutionary dream into a nightmare.
The revolutionaries first destroyed their enemies, and then they started destroying one another. The revolution devours its own children.
The bravery of Marie Antoinette, the beauty of an irresistible assassin, the terror of a royal mistress, and the disastrous execution of Louis XVI.
He was portly, he had an extremely thick neck, more about which later.
From its origins in Scotland to the final terror in Nazi Germany.
In the Nazi time, 50 or 60 executions per day took place, and so everything has to go very, very quick.
Did life really end with the falling of the blade?
It is conceivable that the separated head would retain consciousness for up to 15 seconds.
The complete history of this macabre machine known as the guillotine. The guillotine is a terrifying emblem of death, violence, and power. A symbol of 18th century Europe's technological achievement and the French Revolution's distorted humanity and equality. How could such a noble vision end in an epidemic of mass killing? The answer begins centuries before the Revolution, in the late Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were a time of feudal rule. The masses were dominated by the few. The church was the common denominator. It was a violent age where life was short, justice was swift, punishments were harsh, and executions were common. A brutal time where few were concerned about the pain and suffering of the condemned.
Life was cheaper in earlier centuries. I don't think we can doubt that. But I think people had a lot more faith and interest in the Old Testament view of God. Message that came across very much of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth.
It was a bloody time that executions didn't stand out as the only cruel and unusual thing that you'd pass in a day. Very few people lived past what we call middle age, and lives were shortened by all sorts of things. Disease is only one of them.
Executions were meant to deter and eliminate criminals. The most common method was by hanging. There were also crucifixions, drownings, and burnings at the stake. And for the most heinous crimes, there were two truly horrifying punishments. The first was to be broken by the wheel. Sometimes an iron bar was used, and at others a wheel broke every bone in the condemned's body.
There were two different types of that executions. The one from above, starting at the heart or at the neck, killing immediately, and the more severe form, starting from the feet, killing that person maybe even after several hours.
The other extreme punishment of the age was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Drawing meaning to pull out or disembowel.
The unfortunate victim was hanged until he or she was unconscious, was then removed from the gallows, allowed to recover consciousness.
They cut out your insides while you're still alive and fish them out. And then they hack parts of your body loose, but not totally, and then they tie your four limbs to horses who pull in opposite directions.
However, most of these methods of execution were for commoners. In a time of extreme class distinctions, where power and honor were associated with military strength and weapons, the nobility were usually beheaded with a blade, a sword, or an axe.
The connection of the sword as a mode of execution for the nobility is connected with the fact that only nobles could wear swords in the first place, and also that this would be the most painless method of execution. It also would not deform the body. It would simply sever the head from the body, and therefore the aim would be to one clean stroke.
But this preferred method of execution had problems as well. Most of them centered on the executioner, a man who had a demanding but thankless job.
Problems were, in the first place, that it required great strength and skill, and if the head was not posed properly on the block, or if the executioner missed the exact spot, it might take several strokes. It might be extremely painful. And also, if more than one person was executed, the blade would become dulled.
If the executioner works well, the crowd is clapping like in the circus, cheering the executioner that he has done good work. But if he fails, if, for example, the first stroke takes away the head, but finds someone on the shoulder or something like that, the crowd gets angry. And rumors start, and many executioners were killed because they did bad work.
As Europe entered the Renaissance, science and technology flourished. Inventors created all kinds of new machines. It was only natural that they would attempt to improve on the ancient execution methods and create the vogue for beheading. One of the first came from Scotland. It was called the Maiden.
What the Scots were really demonstrating was that they were abreast of technical developments. They were showing that they didn't rely on primitive methods. They could come up with a sophisticated bit of apparatus for doing the job properly.
Scotland used the Maiden from 1564 to 1710. Over that period, more than 120 criminals were executed, including the Earl of Argyll, Archibald Campbell. This Protestant leader rebelled against the Catholic king, James II. He was executed by the Maiden in Edinburgh in 1661. Then, as now, the origin of the name the Maiden was unknown.
I would guess that it may be the result of a bit of black humor, if you like. After all, it's quite typical for humankind to personify as female pieces of apparatus, pieces of equipment like boats and planes. So yeah, by calling it the Maiden, you're indicating that the Maiden is female. But another characteristic of a maiden, if you like, is that they're young, they're fresh, they're unblooded, and perhaps there's some sort of wry comment there.
In the 18th century, the old methods of execution were still in use as the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment approached. In France, philosophers like Voltaire, Diderot and Rousseau spoke of equality and the rights of man. The public was beginning to show dissatisfaction with the old class distinctions, the stagnating economy, and the king, Louis XVI. On July the 14th, 1789, the crisis peaked, and rebellious Parisians attacked an old fortress where for centuries the French nobility had imprisoned their enemies. They stormed the Bastille.
Storming didn't liberate that much prisoners, but liberated ideas. it's really a symbol of the population freeing themselves.
It was the beginning of the French Revolution, an era associated with the bastardization of virtuous intentions and the guillotine. Over the next 10 years, the bourgeoisie and peasantry would struggle to reform the monarchy amid the old political system, including its penal code. One of the first deputies elected to the Revolution's Constitutional Assembly was a medical doctor and professor of anatomy named Joseph Ignace Guillotine.
He was a typical 18th century man of science, man of learning with humanitarian ideals who wished to reduce human suffering and promote justice.
In the autumn of 1789, Guillotine proposed that criminals should be given the same punishment regardless of their class, and that for capital crimes, the government should create a humane, standardized form of execution. 2 years later, a surgeon named Dr. Louis designed the new beheading machine. Despite the doctor's role, the machine was named after the man who had proposed it, the guillotine. Like the maiden, it had a heavy blade that dropped between two wooden posts. In addition, it had two important innovations: a wooden block called a lunette that held the head in place, and a table that held the body called a bascule.
The bascule allowed for the patient to be unruly. He could be shouting and yelling and the job could go on. He could be fighting every inch of the way and it would still work. It was tidy in that it didn't require the person to be conscious even.
On April the 17th, 1792, the newly constructed guillotine was tested for the first time on 3 corpses. 1 week later, a murderer and thief named Nicolas Jacques Pelletier became the first victim of the blade. Both the designer and executioner were impressed, maybe even alarmed by the results.
A fine machine, so long as its facility is not abused.
It decapitated thee so cleanly that one was astonished by the force and the celerity of its action.
Once you had a machine that could kill large numbers of people very quickly and efficiently, there's a sense in which the machine then demands victims. The problem was, once you had a machine that could do this, then it created its own demand for victims.
From the outset, the guillotine was a sensation. The execution was a great play with established acts. The introduction, the build-up, the last words, and the bloody climax, complete with the display of the victim's head. It was compelling theatre, complete with real-life actors, the perfect stage, and above all else, a wildly enthusiastic crowd, thrilled by the sights and sounds of an execution.
Deep down inside all of us, there's that aspect, that primitive bit that is fascinated by it. We all know it's cruel and it's horrible and we're repelled by it, but also there's a kind of attraction. It's a bit of an elastic. There's a pull. Just as there is an interest in the miracle of birth, the miracle of death is equally absorbing. People are terribly interested in the moment that life begins, and also the moment of death.
The use of public executions as a moral warning to an assembled multitude poses problems, because we know from accounts of such crowds that very often they enter into a festive mood. There's drinking, there's a kind of both sexual and bloodlust excitation that takes place, and that rather than taking this as a moral warning and adopting a mood of sobriety, that it tends to lead to unruly crowds and disorder. That is, it stirs up people's lowest emotions rather than awakening their moral sense.
During the summer of 1792, the revolution grew increasingly violent. In August, revolutionaries occupied the royal residence known as the Tuileries. They imprisoned the royal family in an old monastery called the Temple. A month later, in September, there was another riot. Crowds broke into 7 prisons filled with nobles and clergy. They massacred 1,000 of them. Still, some felt the revolution was moving too slowly. The economy was a shambles. Revolutionary leaders feared a counter-revolution, and they all blamed the king, Louis XVI.
He was portly. He had an extremely thick neck, more about which later. He was rather inept. He was a fairly kind man, I think. He had a mechanical turn of mind, and he was capable of mending locks, strangely enough. He would have made an acceptable locksmith. He was not totally detested by the populace.
In November, an iron box was found in the Tuileries with letters proving Louis's secret dealings with pro-royalists and counter-revolutionaries. A month later, the National Assembly brought him to trial. And on January the 18th, 1793, they condemned Louis XVI to death by guillotine. 3 days later, a carriage brought to the scaffold the man now known only as Louis Capet. Waiting for him was a troubled executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson.
He really was dreading the moment when he would have to execute him, because he could see this coming, and he was just horrified at the possibility. But at that time, the climate was so precarious for everybody that to show any hesitation about having to guillotine a royalist or a member of the royal family would have been enough to have cost Sanson his head.
The executioner's dread was well-founded. The problems began at the foot of the scaffold, when with the drums beating, Louis left his carriage.
Of course, in order to get a clean blow of the blade of the guillotine, they had to cut his hair, they had to take his jacket off, and they had to take his necktie off. And this was an insufferable insult for him to be touched by an executioner or by executioner's assistants. So he began to resist. It's said that he even actually fought them at this point, which was not terribly dignified. Finally, his confessor intervened and said that if he submitted to this indignity, it would be one more proof of the resemblance between him and the god whose mortal representative he was.
With his hands bound, Louis mounted the scaffold and addressed the crowd.
Frenchmen, I die innocent. It is from the scaffold and near to appearing before God that I tell you so. I pardon my enemies. I desire that France.
But his last words were overwhelmed by the drums. Sanson strapped him to the bascule, lowered the lunette, and the blade fell.
And perhaps because the king was a little uncomfortable, perhaps because he'd scuffled a little bit, he must have been badly aligned on the plank. And so the blade, when it fell, it encountered this thick neck and this slightly wriggling, corpulent, misaligned king, and it did not immediately sever the head. It cut through the neck and it hit the jawbone, and there it stayed. So the executioner and his assistants had to lean on the blade and depress it with all their might to actually finish the job, which must have been horrible for the king.
The King of France was traditionally supposed to possess healing powers. And even though this was the middle of the revolution, some people still believed that. So, of course, this was a rare opportunity to get king's blood in order to heal, well, all kind, whatever sickness they may have.
There are always stories about people dipping handkerchiefs, dipping pieces of clothing into the blood. And I think what we could say there is that this goes along with many guillotines, that people want a souvenir. And also, we know that anybody standing anywhere near the scaffold would get splattered, because one of the gruesome facts about the guillotine is that it's extremely bloody.
It resembles the behavior of the faithful in regarding the martyrdom of a saint. Its value as souvenir or as commercial object was very important. And certainly, in some cases, an interest on the part of some revolutionaries in having a piece, not just of history, but an object which could then itself be defiled again.
The execution of Louis XVI ended the monarchy. And now, with the king dead, the French Revolution's hunger for violence grew even greater. In July 1793, Maximilien Robespierre joined the revolution's ruling committee of public safety. By the autumn, his power had grown, and his tyrannical legislation was inaugurating a bloody era of persecution and paranoia, known as the Reign of Terror.
People were denounced by their neighbors. People were denounced by their relations. People who saw people doing what they thought might be subversive. They might be writing down a recipe, but they were thought to be sending political notes.
Nobody was really safe. Since it was working on a denunciation basis, it was impossible to be safe. One always has one enemy somewhere. So for whoever was involved or even not involved in the political spheres, it was a period where one had to be extremely careful.
The first and most notable execution of the Reign of Terror was that of Louis XVI's wife, the former queen consort, Marie Antoinette. Born in Austria, she married Louis when she was 15 and he was 16. During her reign, Marie Antoinette was known for her extravagant spending and her support of the privileges of the nobility and the monarchy. Now 38 and prematurely grey, she was detested by the public. In August 1793, the Queen was placed in solitary confinement in the Conciergerie, the Gothic palace where the revolutionaries held their tribunals. From that day on, her captors made every effort to humiliate her.
For the revolutionaries, they did everything they could to denigrate her. They wrote scurrilous things about her. They ridiculed her and did pornographic cartoons and songs about her. They said she was a whore. They said that she slept with her son. Everything was done to ridicule her.
This is the prisoner's corridor. This is one of the main passageways of the prison. It led off to cells occupied by various prisoners. Now let me show you something about the doors of the cells. This is a regular size cell door. It would be about this height. Now if you look at the one over here, you'll see it's extremely different. Now this door here, as you can see, is cut much lower. This is the cell of Marie Antoinette. Now according to legend, this door was built expressly for Marie Antoinette. Now, it wasn't because she was a short woman. It was just a form of humiliation. On the few occasions the Queen left this cell, it was for interrogation. Members of the public prosecution would be waiting here for the Queen, and upon leaving her cell, she would have to bow her head down in front of her captors. It was to remind her she was no longer royal, the monarchy was finished, and that she was just a common citizen, just as anybody else. She was the citizen Marie Antoinette.
On the morning of her execution, October the 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette was met at her cell by the executioner Sanson, the same man who had beheaded her husband. Unlike the king, whose hands were tied at the scaffold, Marie Antoinette's were tied before leaving the conciergerie. The king had ridden in a carriage. The queen was further humiliated by riding in a simple peasant cart, a tumbrel.
The tumbrel that was to take her to the place of execution was little better than a manure cart. She wasn't expecting that. She was probably expecting a carriage, or at least some sort of respectable conveyance as her husband had had. And when she saw this, she literally her entrails revolted, and she had to ask to be set free and go and relieve herself in a corner of the courtyard, the Queen of France.
Along the route, the crowd taunted her, but she remained brave. As she faced the horrifying sight of the guillotine, she did not hesitate. She mounted the scaffold steps as though they were a grand stairway at their side. She wasn't given a chance to speak any last words to the public. Her last words were only a courteous apology to the executioner.
In the commotion, she apparently trod on Sanson's foot, and it is said that her famous last words were, "I beg your pardon, monsieur, I did not do that on purpose." And then they strapped her down and cut off her head, and that was that.
One of the revolutionaries said, "The revolution devours its own children." And this is something that applies not only to the French Revolution, but to most violent revolutions. That is, most violent revolutions that start out wanting to liberate end up by destroying their own architects, and that's certainly what happened in the French Revolution. That is, the revolutionaries first destroyed their enemies, and then they started destroying one another.
Over the next 10 months, the terror continued. More than 300,000 were arrested, and 17,000 were executed by the guillotine. Though many nobles and clergy died, now the vast majority of those who went to the guillotine were middle class or peasants. All the while, the theatre of the guillotine continued, as each victim went through the same performance. Even a group of Carmelite nuns were condemned. They sang their last words.
The church was disorganized, and only those priests who would play ball who became the juring clergy, those who swore allegiance to the new state, were allowed to operate as priests, and others who did not, and that was the majority, they were outlawed, and that closed down convents of nuns, and these Carmelites were suppressed, but they refused to obey and were finally condemned and were brought to the guillotine as a group, and were joined in that group by a runaway member who had left the order, and they sang at the bottom of the scaffold, and as their numbers were reduced until finally there was only the one voice left, and then there was none.
Though most of the famous executions during the Terror took place in Paris, the vast majority occurred in the provinces. Here, because of the great distances, the guillotine often travelled. Outside Lyon, one of the few original travelling guillotines still remains today. In the years it operated in the region, it's estimated that hundreds of people fell to its blade.
It was carried by these committees into small towns throughout France, and the whole idea was they were going to root out the rotten aristocrats, and they'd go in and they'd cleanse the town, and they thought that would fix everything. But what it quickly did was to unleash an anarchy of local power mongers who more or less abused their authority, and those that abused it the most wound up getting guillotined themselves.
What happened was, once you were outside of Paris, the extremes in the fanaticism and the lawlessness increased. Very often people became completely fanatic and found that they had limitless power, and as we know what limitless power does to people.
Many stories recount the corruption of the provincial executioners. It seems that almost anyone could wield the power of a guillotine. The position of executioner was even given to a professional clown.
In the town where he came, he moved from simply being a clown to being a member of the Revolutionary Council that condemned others to death. Therefore, he moved from his purely theatrical function to a position of power in which he could condemn others. And then eventually he was himself condemned, and he was condemned to appear on the scaffold in his uniform as clown and executed as clown.
However, as the terror continued, revolutionary zeal began to give way to concerns about the contraption. It was designed to be fast, efficient, and humane. There was now no doubt that it was fast and efficient, but was it humane? Was there really no pain after the blade severed the head? One of the first executions to arouse suspicion was that of Charlotte Corday, the assassin of the radical revolutionary leader Jean-Paul Marat.
Charlotte Corday, who and everyone was in love with her, even the people who condemned her, because she was so she was a beautiful woman, very young, very fresh, and it was a very hard one for the tribunal to condemn her.
Corday had violently disagreed with Marat's extreme beliefs, and on July the 13th, 1793, she stabbed Marat in the heart while he soaked in the bath. 4 days later, Charlotte Corday stepped into the tumbrel.
There was a thunderstorm while she was in the tumbrel. She was drenched, and it clung to her red smock, so all the people could see the outline of her body and her bosom and everything, and they were delighted. A lot of very impressionable young men were watching from upstairs windows of these narrow streets as she passed, and one young fellow called Adam Lux fell hopelessly in love with her, and poets wrote lines about this.
As the tumbrel approached the guillotine, the executioner, hoping to spare Corday the anxiety of seeing the guillotine, blocked her view. But Corday would have none of it.
She pushed him aside. She said, "I have the right to see one. I have the right to be curious. I've never seen such a thing before." And of course, everyone admired that very much.
However, what Charlotte Corday was best remembered for was less her beauty and courage, and more how her execution reminded the public of the possibility that there was pain and even life after the blade fell.
When the head was actually severed and the executioner's assistant held it up for the crowd to see and jeer at, he slapped it. And it's said that the head blushed. It's this question of whether there was sensation after the head was actually severed, and whether Charlotte Corday could have had any of her normal personality structure still remaining intact, enough to realize that this terrible affront had been administered her after her death even.
Over the years, this concern about life after the blade led a number of reputable scientists to some bizarre experiments. One used a dog's blood system to try to revive a head. Another supposedly roused a head by shouting at it. Perhaps the most famous involved Antoine Lavoisier, the dedicated chemist who discovered oxygen. He decided to turn his own execution into a final experiment.
He was a political prisoner, pure and simple. At any rate, Lavoisier, being a scientist to the last, made an agreement with his friend who accompanied him to the scaffold. And Lavoisier said that once his head was severed, he would attempt to blink as many times as he could until he lost consciousness. And Lavoisier's head was severed, and I believe he blinked 13 or 14 times.
Was there any validity to their concerns? What do contemporary doctors say?
If one goes on the premise that the brain deprived of oxygen can remain conscious for a short period of time, and when I say short, I mean a matter of, let's say, up to 15 seconds, then it is conceivable that the separated head would retain consciousness for up to 15 seconds. The senses of hearing, sight, and smell still exist within the head. You don't need the rest of the body to process those sensations. And so theoretically, it is possible that a decapitated head would retain the senses of smell, taste, hearing, and sight for up to that 15 seconds.
The other concern about the inhumanity of the blade was the mental anguish of anticipating a guillotine death. Though most nobles, out of a sense of honor, pride, and courage, went to the blade without resistance, Madame du Barry did not. She had been the mistress of Louis XVI's grandfather, and though she was known for her generous gifts to the poor, she also ultimately faced the blade. But unlike many of high rank who preceded her, Madame du Barry did not feign courage.
When you consider Madame du Barry, I mean, here was an extremely charming, pleasant, attractive woman who kept her health, who took daily walks, who was kind to everybody, entertained all manner of people. She just loved being alive. She didn't want to die. She would do anything she could, put it off to the very last minute.
While in the tumbrel, she pleaded with the crowd to save her. She was dragged fighting up the scaffold steps. It took 4 men to tie her down. Her screams were heard a mile away on the other side of the River Seine. But unlike many executions before, where the doomed had behaved so bravely and the crowds had cheered their end, with Madame du Barry, the crowd was silent.
And seeing this, people finally were touched and fled like an army in defeat on all sides from in front of the scaffold. Strangely enough, when they saw aristocrats or other people who displayed icy composure, maintaining their sang-froid to the end, it never touched them. They just watched these heads being smitten off as if they were round stones. But when they saw Madame du Barry's very human grief, it finally touched some visceral emotion in them, and they just couldn't face it, they just fled. And even Sanson himself had to look aside, he couldn't watch.
It became clear she was just a terrified woman who was about to have her head chopped off. And people have suggested that if the victims of the guillotine had protested, had forced the executioners to drag them, had screamed and yelled the way Madame du Barry had, then perhaps the whole thing wouldn't have lasted so long.
Maybe because of deaths like Madame du Barry's, or maybe because of the staggering number of executions, over 25 a day in Paris alone, by the summer of 1794, public opinion began to turn against the indiscriminate use of the guillotine. The people blamed the man behind the terror, Maximilien Robespierre. Now, he too would pay the ultimate price.
I think it just went too far. It just went too far in that paranoia of the time, suspecting everybody of anything. And nobody was secure anymore, and therefore they stopped believing in him.
There was unrest in the population. They began to see, where's this going? Look at the blood flowing in the streets. The Place de la Concorde smelled of blood. Where no one was safe, and they began to see that everyone was in danger. And that this would go on, that Robespierre was a madman, that he would not be satisfied unless everyone was himself, where he had reduced the population to himself.
On July the 27th, 1794, Robespierre and 98 of his followers were seized by their opponents. The next day, he too faced the guillotine. During his capture, his jaw had been shattered by a bullet. Before his execution, the bandage was painfully removed. There were no last words.
And it's almost like a chain letter or one of those financial pyramids. That is, he thinks that by just extending it a little longer, he's going to win. But of course, what happened? The whole thing collapsed, and it collapsed with his being executed, along with Saint-Just and his other followers. And at that point, once Robespierre and Saint-Just were executed, then suddenly the whole pyramid structure collapsed. People saw that this was not the direction that would work, and the terror came abruptly to an end.
The execution of Robespierre marked the end of the terror. So many dead, so many good intentions gone bad. The public mourning of the dead began. Many cried. Others chose more macabre ways of celebrating the passing of the nightmare.
These were the children of those guillotined. Some of them were children of the executioners, and sometimes they were children of the victims. And there was just sort of one big celebration and party, and these were called the bal des victimes, the victims' balls. And they had various quirks of dress to show this, to dramatize this. They would wear a red ribbon around the neck that would be like the mark made by the guillotine, and they would greet one another with a special nod of the head as though their head were about to fall off.
Over the next 150 years, France continued its internal dispute over the merits of monarchy versus republic. During this time, France continued to use the guillotine. Though now, instead of dozens of executions of political prisoners a day, it was a handful of criminals a year. And as its use declined, so did its terrifying image.
Scaffold is ordered to be removed. And so this quite literally, it is, if you will, the supreme play without a stage. It's brought down to the ground level, and the famous glistening blade that was to be the major final, if momentary, movement in the supreme drama is itself darkened. So without a stage, without the large audience, without the procession, the execution becomes no longer a spectacle, but indeed a quiet prop for the state's power.
If you believe that the guillotine had a kind of higher authority, and that this ritual, as rituals are supposed to, reflected some transcendent system, then removing all these sounds, removing all these sights, such as the gleam of the blade, all of this was reducing its awesome power. It was trying to make the guillotine seem less frightening, and to make it simply a quiet way of killing people.
But the era of the guillotine was not completely over. In the early 1930s, as Hitler took control of Germany, 140 years after the French Revolution, the guillotine blade began to fall again. A new reign of terror began. The victims were political opponents of the Nazi regime.
Only a very small percentage of criminals, but many political prisoners. Well, even capital punishment could have been taken, even if you hear BBC or any American radio station during the war. Even if you steal a little bit during bombing, could cause capital punishment. Telling Hitler can't win the war could cause capital punishment.
From 1933 to 1945, the Nazis installed 45 guillotines in Germany and the countries they occupied. 16,500 political prisoners were guillotined, almost exactly the same number as during the French Revolution. Between 1944 and 1945 alone, 10,000 people fell to the blade. And in one 11-hour period, 70 people were executed. To accommodate this huge demand, the Nazis brought 20th century technology to the 18th century design.
The purpose of these new advancements were, of course, to shorten the time of the executions. to make the executions quicker than they have been in former times, they left the so-called wagon. The wagon, that's a board with wheels on which the person was bound. After that, the wheels were turned. It rolled up to the blade, and after the blade went down, the wheels went back, and that takes time. So they eliminated it. They had other technical advantages, for example, to bring the blade back to the normal position. That gears are much more easier to move than the old type. And the way the blade runs down is very short, so it takes only a very short time to cut the head.
The victory of the Allies and the end of the Second World War put an end to the guillotine in Germany, but the French continued to use it throughout the late 70s. Between 1965 and 1977, 8 men were executed. The last 2 were murderers who died by the blade in June 1977. 4 years later, in 1981, France abolished capital punishment, ending the era of the guillotine. But even as the guillotine left the stage as the official method of execution in France, its impact around the world continued. With tourist attractions like Madame Tussauds in London, and people fascinated by its design. Even businesses named after it, and in the arts, in films, theatre and books. After more than 2 centuries, the legacy of the beheading machine of the French Revolution continues to haunt us.
The whole story of the French Revolution is a story of madness, of political madness, of madness in a good cause, of madness leading to further madness, of incremental movements that from one idiocy to another, from one kind of madness to another.
They were totally high on idealism, and the guillotine was perhaps its most absurd apotheosis. It was the culmination, and it's a good symbol. So it became the symbol of rationality run amok, as it were, and overconfidence.
The terrible paradox that this instrument, which was meant to be rapid, which it certainly was, egalitarian, which again it was, the paradox was that this invention was so incredibly misused.
The guillotine is an image associated with violence, but it's associated with all kinds of violence. The violence of the guillotine itself, the violence of the reprisals that the state takes, but also the violence of the crimes that leads the criminal to the guillotine, and perhaps the violence of society in general.
Although the blade no longer falls today, we may not have heard the last of the guillotine.
Well, that was the rather bloody history of the guillotine. You've been watching Top of the Docks, a selection from Discovery's 50 most popular programmes ever. And we continue next with a look at another terrible period of European history,